Hey guys, tonight we're going to confront a horrible secret buried within the glorious pages of history. Forget the image of the powerful queen we once knew. All that remains now is a living corpse decomposing right inside Richmond Palace. In her final days, Elizabeth I lay motionless, her body rotting and emitting a putrid smell so pungent that even her most loyal servants were driven to retch. Her stomach was swollen, taut like a balloon about to burst, while festering sores covered her purplish flesh, oozing fluid and pus. The foul stench haunted every corner of the palace, mingling with the sound of rats gnawing and crawling over her in the darkness, turning a glorious reign into a living nightmare. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Before we begin, please take a few seconds in the comments below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Queen Elizabeth I, known by the title the Virgin Queen, was born on the 23rd of September in the year 1533 at Greenwich Palace. She was the daughter of King Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. She was the granddaughter of King Henry VII and Queen Elizabeth of York, inheriting the illustrious Tudor line. In her early years, Elizabeth witnessed the tumult of the court. At the age of 3, her beloved mother was imprisoned and executed on charges of treason, and her father swiftly replaced one queen as one might change a cloak, all in pursuit of a male heir. Even as a small child, Elizabeth understood that a woman's status in the royal family could be both a privileged mantle and a perilous burden. When her father passed away, her half-siblings immediately became entangled in fierce struggles for the succession. Yet Elizabeth, with her characteristic gentle resolve, maintained both patience and keen intelligence. In the year 1558, at the age of 25, she officially ascended the throne of England, marking a magnificent milestone for the Tudor dynasty. Her reign lasted for 45 years, one of the golden ages of English history. She established the Church of England, strengthened ties with Europe through deft diplomacy, and, most notably, defeated the Spanish Armada in the year 1588, an event that solidified England's naval and commercial supremacy. However, despite being celebrated as the Great Queen, Elizabeth was not without flaws. She gained a reputation for ruthless policies towards suspected traitors, most notably in the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, and she even harshly suppressed Irish uprisings to maintain her authority. That sternness sometimes alienated loyal subjects, and her image as the unyielding queen sparked considerable controversy within the court. In the stillness of the night before dawn on the 24th of March in the year 1603, three of the Queen's most trusted confidants, Dr. Richard Manningham, Lady Helena Snakenborg, and an unnamed minister secretly gathered at Richmond Palace. By the flickering lamplight, they solemnly swore to keep the forthcoming events hidden from all. The scene seemed suspended in time, their laboured breaths mingling with the faint tapping of wind against the stone window frames. Before them lay the opulent garments Elizabeth had worn for nearly half a century. Sumptuous layers of silk petticoats, intricately embroidered lace, and a rigid corset of whale, bone, steel, and wood. Piece by piece, they carefully removed each layer, peeling away the thick white lead makeup known as Venetian ceruse that had concealed her face for so long. Like a cruel play reaching its final act, each ribbon and steel hook was loosened, each bone-stiff stay was lifted, revealing a body that bore no resemblance to the delicate legend preserved in portrait and poem. They recoiled in horror as the skin beneath the chalky facade peeled away in flakes, revealing festering sores that discharged pus, patches of blackened flesh, and hair that had fallen out in blotches. Teeth, row by row, loosened and fractured. The necrotic wounds exuded a dense, tar-like fluid that smelled of iron and decay, forcing all three to gasp for air. In the lamplight, the corrosion of lead and mercury had left sinuous black veins like withered spiderwebs upon her skin. When the corset was finally freed, the crackling of warped ribs sounded like brittle timber splintering, and masses of dead tissue clung to the whalebone stays, oozing dark blood and tattered cloth. Next they uncovered her internal organs, blackened, shrunken, and pitted with deep holes, as though every spark of life had been drained from within. Then came the most grotesque discovery: a second heart, a tumour the size of a goose egg, dark purple and riddled with cavities. When it was incised, it poured forth a thick, metallic scented blood. Within its core lay tangled hair and fragments of tooth matter, a teratoma. A monstrous growth of disordered tissues. These harrowing revelations not only testified to the ravages of a toxic beauty regimen, lead and mercury seeping into her flesh, but also confirmed the terrifying truth that throughout her 40-year reign, Elizabeth had transformed her body into a political facade, a mask of purity, that proclaimed divine right and independence at the expense of her physical and mental well-being. Stunned, the three witnesses, Manningham, Snakenborg, and the unnamed minister, stood motionless, eyes wide with shock. Immediately afterward, they were ordered to separate, bound by an oath of silence under penalty of death, and within weeks their names vanished from the record. The dreadful secret of the Queen's body entombed alongside her for eternity. The story begins in the 1530s, when Princess Elizabeth was but 3 years old and witnessed her mother, Princess Anne Boleyn, beheaded on fabricated charges of treason. In those earliest years, the young princess watched with tear-filled eyes as her father, King Henry VIII, cast aside one queen after another in his relentless pursuit of a male heir, each marriage and execution teaching her that a woman's fate in the royal court was both a weapon and a weakness, a slender blade capable of carving out power yet liable to cut its wielder at any moment. From that point onward, Elizabeth embarked upon a lifelong transformation of body and image, employing layer upon layer of toxic white ceruse, laced with high concentrations of lead, to paint her face into the guise of everlasting purity. Beneath her sumptuous gowns lay a corset of whalebone, steel, and wood, drawn so tightly each morning that it reshaped her ribs into an almost impossible silhouette, one that delighted the courtiers, but tormented her lungs and organs. Voluminous skirts and hidden farthingales multiplied her stature, creating a living statue that adored subjects from afar, but steered clear of any close inspection. Every dawn, she surrendered herself to the ministrations of her attendants, each brushstroke of powder, and every tightening of laces transforming her into a theatrical emblem, a monarch more mask than flesh. Mirrors were forbidden in her private chambers. She was permitted only fractured reflections in broken shards of glass, lest the true contours of her face be glimpsed and her secret exposed. When Elizabeth ascended the throne in the year 1558, at the age of 25, she understood that her vow of perpetual virginity could serve as more than mere statement of personal choice. It was to become a powerful instrument of state. By declaring herself eternally chaste, she averted the automatic transfer of sovereign power to any husband, ensuring that every decree, every treaty, and every alliance remained hers alone to enact. Thus, the governance of England flowed directly from her crown, unfiltered by the claims or influence of a consort. In effect, she turned her own body into a bulwark against foreign ambitions and domestic machinations, a solitary seat of unshared authority. Yet beneath this shrewd political calculus lay a more private terror, the fear of an unnamed impediment, a bodily barrier too shameful to articulate. Whispers in stolen letters and furtive journal entries referred repeatedly to an obstacle within that would forever bar her from marriage. These cryptic notes surfaced and vanished under the vigilant cleansing of court agents, their ink blotted or pages consumed by fire. It was said that Elizabeth herself spoke only of a vague ailment, a wound unseen yet insurmountable, choosing instead to fortify her image of unblemished virtue with ever thicker layers of makeup and ever tighter corsetry. What began as a remedy for youthful insecurity evolved into a rigid regime of concealment, one designed not only to hide cosmetic flaws, but also to mask truths that no subject was permitted to ponder. Through decades of reign, the physical burdens grew heavier, as did the psychological strain of maintaining an unassailable facade. Her courtiers spoke in muted tones of the Queen's precise morning ritual hours spent in silent endurance while the powdered mask was applied, the bones of her torso confined within steel and bone. They marvelled at her composure when entering council chambers, never guessing at the suffocating pressure that had reshaped her very skeleton. It was in those moments, when she stood high upon the dais, that the full power of her carefully wrought image rippled outward, inspiring awe and obedience even as it concealed a body ravaged by its own preservation. And so it was that Elizabeth's life became a testament to the profound cost of image and control, a delicate balance between sovereign strength and personal sacrifice. In the solemn glow of candlelight, as she regarded her reflection, or the closest approximation thereof, she may have wondered at the paradox of her own creation, that the very rituals and artifices intended to secure her liberty had bound her more tightly than any marriage might have done. Yet from that tension emerged the legend of the Virgin Queen, a woman who redefined the power of a monarchy by forging an identity both inviolable and ultimately unsustainable, until the day the layers came undone and revealed the truth beneath. Over the next 2 decades, the slow ravages of time and the toxic beauty regimen began to betray themselves in ever more distressing ways. Underneath the layers of white ceruse, Elizabeth's skin grew pockmarked and perforated, as though tiny holes had been burnt through by acid. Patches of greenish-black discoloration spread across her cheeks and temples, evidence of chronic lead poisoning that no amount of powdered disguise could fully conceal. Her teeth, long subjected to the corrosive effects of lead, darkened to a deep ebony hue before loosening and falling out one by one. To preserve the illusion of regal poise, she learned to cover her mouth with a lace handkerchief when speaking, lest any fortunate onlooker glimpse the gaping voids where her incisors once sat a day. And as the years passed, her hair thinned in irregular tufts, revealing small, raw patches of scalp. Each public appearance required a heavier, more elaborate wig, woven of human and animal hair, stiffened with pitch, and adorned with jewels to mask the havoc beneath. Those towering coiffures pressed upon her temples, compounding the discomfort she bore in silence. Beneath her sumptuous gowns, Elizabeth's flesh festered in private. The dyes used to colour her corsets and petticoats often contained arsenic, inflicting chemical burns on the delicate skin of her waist and hips. Ulcers wept incessantly, refusing all poultices and ointments, while the constant pressure of whalebone stays prevented proper healing. She turned to belladonna eye drops meant to enlarge and darken her gaze, only to discover that the alkaloids blurred her vision and left her pupils dilated, sensitive to light. In dim council chambers, she sometimes wore a black silk eye patch, not for fashion, but to protect a sight weakened by poison. Mercury, another cornerstone of her beauty arsenal, wreaked havoc upon her nervous system. Handled daily in the form of creams and salves, it seeped into her flesh and nerves, causing tremors in her hands, unsteady gait, and moments of profound confusion. Courtiers whispered of how her fingers would quiver as she signed state papers, and how her voice, once steady, sometimes cracked or faltered mid-sentence. Yet when she stood before her subjects, her countenance remained the unchanging emblem of the Virgin Queen, every flaw invisibly smoothed out by practiced posture and the artifice of costume. By the time the 1590s dawned, each of Elizabeth's public outings had become a meticulously choreographed performance lasting 3 to 4 hours. Attendants powdered her face, tightened her corset, piled on layers of petticoats, and coiled her wigs, until the final effect was a living tableau of perfection. Courtiers were instructed to stand at a respectful distance, just close enough to see the grandeur of her robes and jewels, yet too far to notice the telltale tremor in her hands, or the shallow rise and fall of her breath. All the while, the royal physicians maintained detailed private journals. They documented the swelling of her joints, the festering abscesses along her rib cage, and the leech treatments prescribed to draw out corrupted humours. Purgatives and enemas were administered with relentless regularity, each intended to purge her blood of toxins, but instead leaving her listless and weakened. Long after the last echoes of courtly music had faded, Elizabeth's body lay drained of vitality, sustained only by sheer will and the rituals she refused to abandon. Parallel to this physical decay, her mental state began to falter. Episodes of delirium grew more frequent. She would murmur unintelligible phrases in the dark of night, or converse earnestly with her mother, long deceased, believing Anne Boleyn stood at her bedside. Sometimes she awoke in unfamiliar wings of the palace, unable to recall how she had come to be there. Alarmed by these lapses, the Privy Council devised a remarkable precaution. When the Queen was too ill or unwell to appear, a carefully chosen double would stand in her place. Dressed in a simplified replica of her gown and wig, the substitute would glide onto the dais, recite pre-approved phrases, and bow with studied grace, ensuring that the continuity of royal presence remained unbroken. Thus did Elizabeth preserve the illusion of unyielding sovereignty, even as her own mind and body betrayed her. Behind the closed doors of her chambers lay a woman besieged by toxins and time, clinging to every ritual that masked her decline. And outside, the world continued to revere her as the immutable Virgin Queen, unaware of the fragile core concealed beneath layers of ceruse, bone and devotion. In the winter of 1602, Queen Elizabeth's body entered its most rapid phase of collapse. Her legs, once elegantly sheathed in silk stockings and fitted boots, became marred by festering ulcers that emitted a foul, putrid stench. Day and night, attendants burned bundles of aromatic herbs, rosemary, lavender, and sage in every corridor of Whitehall to mask the odour that seeped through the palace walls. The Queen had lost control over her most private functions. Specially tailored undergarments, lined with multiple layers of cloth, restrained any leakage, serving as both concealment and cruel reminder of her deteriorating condition. As March of 1603 approached, Elizabeth's health took a grave turn. During a particularly severe bout of illness, she experienced a convulsive seizure that lasted nearly 1 hour. Foam, tinged with blood, bubbled at her lips as she writhed on the crimson velvet bed, her limbs thrashing in a terrifying display of spasms. Under the flickering candlelight, her attendants and physicians watched in horrified silence, powerless to ease her agony. When the convulsions finally subsided, Elizabeth lay gasping for breath, her eyes briefly clearing. Leaning toward Dr. Richard Manningham, she murmured in a strained whisper, "I bear an iron chain about my neck," before collapsing into a haze of exhaustion and delirium. In that moment of fleeting lucidity, the three witnesses, Manningham, Lady Helena Snakenborg, and an unnamed royal minister, knew they faced a dire imperative. The Queen's body must be examined, and the truth of her condition must be hidden at all costs. Working rapidly and in secret, they performed a post-mortem exploration that would alter the course of English history. Within Elizabeth's chest cavity, nestled beside the still-beating heart, they uncovered a tumour the size of a goose egg, its surface a deep violet black. When incised, it bled a thick, tar-like blood, with a metallic tang so pungent that the surgeons recoiled. Even more unsettling were the fibres of hair and fragments of tooth matter embedded within a clear sign of a teratoma, a grotesque growth containing disordered tissues. But the horrors did not end there. The physicians discovered a second heart, a malformed mass of tissue that pulsed faintly on its own. Patches of anomalous flesh and translucent membranes, never before described in medical texts, defied explanation. Small nodules protruded from ribs warped by decades of tight corsetry, and soft, jelly-like pockets nestled in spaces where bone should have been solid. No contemporary scholar could name these abnormalities. They lay beyond the boundaries of accepted anatomy. Alarmed by the full extent of the Queen's internal devastation, and mindful that public knowledge of such monstrosities could ignite political crisis, the Privy Council moved with ruthless efficiency to conceal every trace. Elizabeth's body was wrapped in multiple layers of undyed linen, soaked in aromatic vinegar to retard decomposition, then placed within a lead-lined coffin. The lid was sealed immediately with molten lead, ensuring no odour or sound could escape. There would be no death mask, no public viewing of her remains, and no ceremonial lying in state to betray the truth of her ravaged flesh. The chamber of examination became a theatre of erasure. Floorboards were stripped away and replaced, walls whitewashed to obliterate any signs of blood or tissue. All surgical instruments, knives, hooks, forceps, were consigned to sacred flames, and any scrap of cloth bearing even the faintest stain was burned. Medical notes, personal letters, and journal entries pertaining to the examination were collected into iron cauldrons and sacrificed to the fire. In the flicker of that inferno, the tangible evidence of Elizabeth's final ordeal was reduced to ash. Once the physical evidence had vanished, attention turned to the witnesses themselves. Manningham, his face pale and haunted, was swiftly dispatched to Scotland under a false identity, his medical credentials buried beneath layers of obfuscation. Lady Helena Snakenborg took vows in a secluded convent, her lips sealed by the weight of holy oaths. The third minister simply faded from records, as though he had walked into oblivion. Within a matter of weeks, all knowledge of their roles had vanished from court annals, leaving only whispers that echoed through the corridors of power. And so the dreadful secret of Queen Elizabeth's body, its tumours, its twin heart, its warped anatomy sank into the shadows of history, shielded by lead, by oath, and by the silent complicity of those who had borne witness. What remained for posterity were fragments of rumour, whispered at dimly lit gatherings, tales of a sovereign whose flesh had been betrayed by her own pursuit of perfection, whose body had become both fortress and prison. The legend of the Virgin Queen endured, impervious to the truth that slept, sealed, beneath layers of metal and silence. The magnitude of this concealment gave rise to a most shocking question. Was Elizabeth truly a woman? When the surgeons peeled back the layers of fabric and flesh, they encountered genital structures bearing both traditionally male and female characteristics. Some whispered of a disorder of sexual development, while others whispered darker tales of the so-called Bisley boy, a rumour that the real Elizabeth had been swapped in childhood for a male heir. Should such revelations emerge, every decree she had signed, every law she had passed, and every victory her Protestant realm had claimed would be thrown into doubt. Dr. Richard Manningham, in his private Latin journal, recorded details so extraordinary that they defied all contemporary anatomy. He spoke of an organ not of the same kind, a structure that belonged neither wholly to male nor female physiology. He described warped ribs, exaggerated deformities, so severe they formed impossible curves and tissues that should not have existed in any human body. Translucent membranes pulsating in defiance of medical texts. These aberrations went far beyond simple pathology. They suggested a physiology both miraculous and monstrous. Alarmed by the political and religious implications, the Privy Council feared that public knowledge of such anomalies could spark civil war or embolden Catholic conspirators to challenge England's Protestant inheritance. To safeguard the realm, they enacted a draconian series of measures. Elizabeth's body was transferred to a second coffin, this one lined with mercury-soaked fabric to inhibit decay, bound in heavy iron chains, and encased in thick sheets of lead. Every seam was soldered until the casket was hermetically sealed, ensuring that neither air nor rumour could escape. Parallel to the physical sealing, the council meticulously erased all documentary evidence. Medical notes, personal letters, and Lady Helena Snakenborg's private reflections were seized, bound in leather volumes, and consigned to roaring pyres behind palace walls. Witnesses' testimonies were extracted under oath, and then burned in the same flames that consumed their words. By day's end, no parchment remained that could attest to the Queen's hidden physiology. In the aftermath, the myth of Gloriana the Virgin Queen was refortified. Portraits were repainted, omitting any trace of infirmity. Official chronicles celebrated her as the flawless embodiment of Protestant virtue, recounting her triumphs without acknowledging the grotesque costs she had borne. The real Elizabeth, the woman whose body had been both altar and crucible, receded into shadow. For centuries, the secret lay buried beneath lead and legend, whispered only in the margins of court gossip. It was not until the 20th century that a few fragments of those lost records resurfaced. In a dusty archive, a scholar discovered charred scraps of Manningham's journal, translated from Latin to reveal cryptic phrases. The demon form within, two hearts beating askew, and a body crafted by both nature and nightmare. Elsewhere, a bundle of letters from Snakenborg emerged, encoded with subtle references to a masquerade of flesh, hinting at her vow of silence and the horrors she had witnessed. These tantalizing fragments offered only glimpses of the truth, tantalizing yet incomplete. Historians pieced together these shards, recognizing that the body beneath Elizabeth's regal attire had been so distorted by lead, corsetry, and perhaps by the very nature of her being that it defied any single explanation. Medical scholars debated whether she had suffered from an intersex condition, whether chronic poisoning had induced tissue mutations, or whether some combination of both had yielded the impossible anatomies described. Despite the resurgence of interest, the official stance remained unchanged. Elizabeth's tomb in Westminster Abbey remains sealed, her casket undisturbed. The vocalix of preservation and respect is invoked, perpetuating the silence she commanded in life. Over time, the case of Elizabeth's hidden anatomy has become enshrined as one of history's most chilling medical conspiracies, a testament to the lengths to which power will go to protect its narrative. And so the Virgin Queen endures, an icon of untouchable authority even as her true body lay ravaged beneath layers of artifice. Her legacy, her laws, her maritime victories, her cultural renaissance shines brightly in textbooks and stained glass windows. Yet intertwined with that legacy lies the dark tale of a woman whose flesh was sacrificed to the demands of sovereignty and spectacle. In the hushed halls of history, the legend of Gloriana persists, immortal and immaculate, while the reality of Elizabeth's corrupted body remains sealed, a dreadful secret too potent ever to fully reveal. After the Queen's body was sealed in the first lead-lined coffin, the Privy Council and her appointed physicians deemed it insufficient to contain the dreadful truth. Thus, they decreed a second, more formidable casket. Its interior lined with mercury-impregnated cloth, its exterior encased in thick iron bands about which heavy chains were coiled, and every seam soldered with molten lead, to seal even the tiniest crevice against air, light and rumour. On the eve of this grim reinforcement, Dr. Richard Manningham, Lady Helena Snakenborg, and the unnamed royal minister who had borne witness to the Queen's most terrible secret were each summoned to separate, shadowed chambers. No longer permitted to confer or communicate, they were isolated under strict orders. Manningham was dispatched northward to Scotland under a false name, his medical instruments concealed beneath his cloak. Lady Snakenborg was compelled to enter a remote convent, taking vows of silence that bound her lips more firmly than any corset had bound the Queen's ribs. The third minister simply vanished from court rolls, as though spirit whisked away by the very shadows he once walked. Simultaneously, every document referencing Elizabeth's condition was collected and consigned to flames. Medical notes, personal diaries, and private letters were torn from bindings and hurled onto pyres behind the palace walls, their crackling inferno sending plumes of ash into the night sky. The examination chamber itself was dismantled, floorboards pried up and replaced, walls whitewashed to erase spots of blood or tissue, and any remaining fragments of cloth stained with bodily fluids were burned until nothing remained but smoke and dust. All physical evidence of the Queen's hidden deformities sank into oblivion, submerged beneath ash and secrecy. In the wake of this erasure, an official account of Elizabeth's passing was crafted with meticulous care. According to the newly issued proclamation, Her Majesty had died peacefully after a brief indisposition. There were no complications beyond the natural frailty of age. The language praised her dignified exit, her final repose described as serene and untroubled. The public bulletin made no mention of lead, mercury, corsetry, or necrosis. Instead, it extolled her illustrious reign, her regal dignity, and her indomitable spirit. The sanitized medical report noted only symptoms consistent with advanced years and the toll of sovereign duty upon a weary frame. To reinforce this carefully cultivated narrative, a funeral of solemn grandeur was arranged at Westminster Abbey. In contrast to the lavish displays common to royal obsequies, there was no open casket, no ceremonial lying in state. A narrow passage through the abbey led the bier directly to the vault, shrouded from view by heavy velvet drapery. Only a handful of the highest nobles, each bound by oath to silence, were permitted to attend. Commoners and clergy alike were barred from offering flowers or lighting candles at her tomb. Any whispered mention of a mysterious or untimely end was swiftly hushed by court officials, who ensured that rumours faded as promptly as they arose. Thus was the image of the Virgin Queen renewed, untarnished, and eternal. In stained glass, oil painting, and stone effigy, Elizabeth remained the austere symbol of Protestant virtue and English strength, her form perfected in the public imagination. Meanwhile, the ruthless suppression of all contrary evidence helped maintain a seamless transition of power to King James VI of Scotland, who ascended as James I of England in the year 1603. This policy of silence and concealment was deemed essential to forestall any Catholic faction or rebellious noble from exploiting whispers of scandal to foment unrest. And so, through layers of lead and legend, the legacy of Elizabeth endured unsullied, her true body entombed in secrecy, her name enshrined in myth. The carefully orchestrated cover-up secured not only the reputation of a monarch, but the fragile stability of a realm in transition, ensuring that the icon of the Virgin Queen shone brightly, unshadowed by the grim reality that lay sealed beneath her leaden tomb. When James I ascended the English throne, succeeding Elizabeth in the year 1603, he inherited not only a crown but a legacy of secrecy so profound that had endured for centuries. From his first proclamations, James's government upheld the absolute confidentiality that had protected Elizabeth's final resting place. Repeated petitions from scientists, from foreign envoys, even from learned physicians, urged that the tomb be opened and its occupant examined by modern methods. Each time, the British authorities answered with the same solemn refrain: "We must preserve the integrity of our national monument and respect the repose of the deceased." Yet behind those official assurances stirred a deeper, darker fear that to disturb Elizabeth's coffin might unleash truths too terrible for any crown or kingdom to bear. Thus the lead-sealed sarcophagus remained untouched through 2 world wars, through the upheavals of empire and the rise of democracy, its secrets entombed beneath layers of stone and protocol. It was not until the 20th century that non-invasive technologies offered a glimpse beyond the tomb's impenetrable walls. In 1950, a ground-penetrating radar survey revealed astonishing anomalies: vast sheets of dense material far thicker than masonry, curious voids suggesting hidden cavities, and strong reflections consistent with metal, perhaps iron chains, perhaps layers of coal-like substance carefully packed around the coffin. A second survey, conducted in 1975, confirmed these findings. Yet both times the custodians of Westminster Abbey refused further inquiry. "We must not disturb a sacred trust," they declared, their voices echoing through marble corridors even as the radar maps lay sealed in government archives. Meanwhile, scholars turned to the surviving relics of Elizabeth's regalia, preserved in the National Collection. A fragment of her original corset, its fabric still fragrant with age, was subjected to microscopic analysis. The researchers discovered flecks of dried blood, a residue of animal fat, and countless granules of lead dust embedded in the weave. The stitching bore unusual reinforcement around the waist and bust, evidence that the corset had been tailored to compress her ribs far beyond fashion's demands. In a porcelain jar once holding her ceremonial face powder, chemical assays revealed lead levels dozens of times higher than those known to cause acute poisoning. Each data point painted a consistent picture: a queen who had subjected her body to daily, lifelong exposure to potent toxins. At the same time, diplomats' private dispatches long archived in foreign capitals offered yet more clues. An ambassador to London wrote of Elizabeth's striking physique: her shoulders, broad as those of a seasoned captain; her voice, a husky command more akin to a man-at-arms than a lady of courtly breeding. Another envoy noted the precision of her movements. She stands as though drilled in military posture, each gesture measured, deliberate. A third described her hands strong, broad, like those of a sculptor, tools that more resembled a craftsman's grip than a courtier's grace. Though couched in the courteous language of diplomacy, these observations betrayed an undercurrent of curiosity and unease at a form that defied expectations. These disparate strands of evidence, radar signatures, textile analyses, powdered makeup assays, and diplomatic musings, began to coalesce into a tantalizing hypothesis. Perhaps Elizabeth had suffered from a disorder of sexual development, such as complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, which might explain both her pale exterior and her internal physiology. Or perhaps she had been the so-called Bisley boy, a male heir reared in female guise. Yet without permission to breach the lead seals of her coffin, these theories could never be tested by direct examination. In time, the fragmentary documents found their way into specialized academic journals, footnotes to countless studies of Tudor politics and Renaissance fashion. Historians and medical scholars quietly debated the possibilities, always noting the caveat: no invasive study of her remains has ever been permitted. And so the enigma endures, a puzzle locked behind centuries of custom and caution. Through it all, Elizabeth's image remained unassailable. In stained glass windows, she still shone as the timeless Virgin Queen. In sonnets and dramas, her reign was immortalized as an age of glory. Yet beneath the surface of those venerated legends lay the unsettling prospect of a body transformed by artifice and anomaly, a reminder that the greatest secrets sometimes lie cupped in lead and silence. As the candlelight of history flickers over her closed tomb, the question remains: will we ever lift the veil on Elizabeth's final sleep? Until then, her story stands as a testament to the lengths to which power will go to guard its narrative, leaving posterity to ponder what truths lie entombed waiting to be uncovered. Silent fragments of Elizabeth's own hand betray the heavy toll her psyche endured beneath all those layers of silk and powder. In her private verse and scattered aphorisms, she returned again and again to images of masks and shells, as though the face she presented to the world was but a fragile facade concealing a far stranger truth. In one oft-quoted stanza, she penned, "I am not the one you see. This bodice is a shell of 1,000 layers," an admission that seems to rise beyond mere metaphor into the realm of confession, hinting at a hidden struggle over identity and form. Centuries later, scholars of historical psychology would sift through these lines as clues to a mind bent by the relentless demands of secrecy. Diagnoses of dissociative and personality disorders have since been proposed, suggesting that the prolonged concealment fractured Elizabeth's sense of self. She forbade any full-length mirror in her private chambers, mirrors being emblems of royal authority, permitting only tiny shards of broken glass to reflect her face in fractured glimpses. In public, she became a living portrait, every movement choreographed, every gesture rehearsed, so that no one might peer beyond the gilded mask. Her courtly image became an illusion so complete that courtiers spoke of her as though she were an apparition, a sovereign sculpted from legend rather than flesh and blood. Modern medical researchers have offered yet another lens through which to view Elizabeth's condition: the possibility of complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, or CAIS. In this scenario, Elizabeth's external appearance would have been typically female, yet her internal physiology would have followed an unexpected course under the influence of androgens. Combined with decades of lead and mercury exposure from her daily cosmetics, such a condition might produce the grotesque anomalies, teratomas, and aberrant tissues that the post-mortem accounts described. Yet this remains speculative, for her lead-sealed coffin has never been opened to confirm or deny these conjectures. Meanwhile, the cultural edifice built around the Virgin Queen grew ever grander. In oil on canvas and carved in wood, in stained glass and in marble statues, Elizabeth's likeness was rendered with an immaculately pale complexion, her face unblemished by time or tragedy. Artists depicted her in wide, sweeping robes, her posture regal and unassailable, her sword or sceptre held aloft as symbols of her indomitable will. Ballads sung by strolling minstrels praised her purity and unwavering resolve. Poets compared her to the moon's perfect light, shining upon a grateful nation. Each portrait and poem served to reinforce the legend, to conceal beneath layers of adulation the harsh reality of her physical decline and psychological strain. In courtly pageants, actors reenacted her triumphs over invaders and rivals, draping themselves in costumes that mimicked her rumoured silhouette: narrow waists, broad shoulders, while audiences applauded the myth, even as the monarch herself remained hidden behind a veil of ceremonial distance. Thus, while Elizabeth's actual body decayed under the weight of its own preservation, her image soared ever higher, an icon of chastity and authority. Every statue erected in her honour, every stained glass window installed in her memory, became another brick in the fortress that protected the truth from the light of day. And so, through the concerted efforts of poets and painters, of courtiers and chroniclers, the tale of Elizabeth the Virgin Queen took on a life of its own, one that bore little resemblance to the tortured woman who lay entombed beneath layers of lead and legend, her final self forever obscured by the very myth she wrought. Whispers of the so-called Bisley Boy legend drifted through the corridors of power like motes of dust in candlelight, its source rooted as much in Elizabeth's unapologetic distance as in the shadows of court gossip. According to the tale, when Princess Elizabeth was but 3 years old, she was spirited away at night and replaced by a royal nephew or cousin, a male child raised in her place, clad in gowns and coiffes, schooled to carry the Tudor name. Though never endorsed by official annals, this story sought to explain the anomalies that even monument and portrait could not wholly conceal. Her husky, unusually deep voice, the breadth of her shoulders, more akin to a nobleman's than a lady's, and the precision of her posture, as though drilled in martial discipline rather than feminine grace. These accusations of an early swap survived only in the private missives of foreign envoys, letters later declassified and published in fragmentary footnotes. Encoded phrases "not a virgin but a youth in disguise" surface in diplomatic correspondence, hidden among compliments about her wit and policy. Each recital hinted at a secret so explosive that it could unravel the fabric of the Protestant settlement she had forged, calling into question the legitimacy of her every law and victory. In public ceremonies, Elizabeth went to elaborate lengths to preempt such suspicions. She stood upon a raised dais, her voluminous skirts fanning out in concentric circles that obscured the shape of her legs and hips. Gentlewomen and pages were instructed to maintain a precise distance, never too near to glimpse the uneven contours of her corseted form, never so far as to appear rude. Every step she took was measured, every gesture rehearsed, creating the illusion of an untouchable figure, an icon carved of stone and silk, rather than a living, breathing person. The court itself became a stage upon which artifice, ritual, and medicine converged in perfect harmony. Painters such as Nicholas Hilliard and George Gower rendered her visage in gentle light, smoothing any irregularity into a flawless mask of youth. In the great hall, masks and pageants depicted her as Diana, goddess of chastity, draped in white linen and crowned with pearls, her stance serene and aloof. Meanwhile, physicians applied layers of lead-based ceruse and tightened her stays with surgical precision, reshaping her body each day to match the portraitist's ideal. Thus, every painted image, every courtly performance, and every medical intervention reinforced the same narrative: Elizabeth as the unblemished Virgin Queen. Behind this grand illusion lay an extraordinary collaboration of disciplines. The visual artists crafted a timeless icon. The courtiers perfected the choreography of distance and decorum. The physicians administered toxic beauty treatments that both preserved and distorted her flesh. Each morning, the Queen surrendered herself to this triad of mask, ritual, and medicine, emerging at midday as a living allegory rather than a mere mortal. And so, the greatest natural camouflage in history took shape, a seamless fusion of politics, culture, and science, designed to conceal a secret nothing short of earth-shattering. In truth, Elizabeth ceased to be simply a woman. She became a carefully orchestrated project, a sovereign shaped by competing forces of self-preservation and spectacle. Her legacy, woven into the very fabric of the nation, depended on the absolute success of this grand deception. The throne she occupied would have toppled the moment any whisper of the hidden boy or ambiguous anatomy found credence among her subjects. As candlelight flickers and the hush of night deepens, consider the marvel of such an enduring illusion. A queen who, through the combined arts of painting, performance, and medicine, transcended the fragile boundaries of flesh and bone to become a symbol of unassailable authority. Yet in every brushstroke, in every silken fold, and in every powdered mask, there lay the echoes of a far darker truth once so carefully concealed that it threatened to unravel the very foundation of an empire. In the soft gloom of history's twilight, the legend of the Virgin Queen endures, an icon preserved in glass and verse, her true form forever, shrouded by the artifice that crafted her. And though centuries have passed, the question remains suspended in the silence. What other secrets lie hidden beneath layers of paint and protocol, waiting for the light to pierce the final veil? And as the tale of the Virgin Queen's untouchable image draws to a close, we come to realize that behind the facade of power and assumed purity lay a private world filled with absurd and revolting hygiene rituals. Elizabeth immersed herself for hours beneath layers of foul, white lead powder, soaked in tubs of rancid herbal concoctions, cinched her flesh into a sweat, soaked, filthy corset, donned wigs teeming with lice, and, at day's end, fumbled through a perfunctory cleansing before tossing herself onto bedsheets stained with dried blood and pus. Next, we will explore in detail 5 aspects of these horrifying hygiene habits, from the morning removal and reapplication of makeup, to the grotesque herbal soaks, the squalid corset, the troublesome wigs, and finally the hasty makeup removal ritual before sleep, to understand the price she was willing to pay for her crown and her legend. Each morning, the ritual of bathing in Venetian ceruse began Elizabeth's day with a ceremony both sacred and sinister. Before the first pale glow of dawn touched the palace windows, her attendants would prepare a thick paste by blending finely ground white lead with precious floral essences imported from Italy: rosewater, violet oil, and a hint of lavender. First, any remnants of yesterday's powder were gently removed with dampened cloths, each swipe revealing patches of inflamed skin beneath. Then, with soft brushes and cotton swabs, the new mixture was carefully applied in successive layers until the Queen's face and exposed neck vanished beneath a flawless, milky mask. This daily mask was not merely cosmetic but absolute. No feature was to remain visible, no freckle, no shadow. As each coat dried, Elizabeth sat motionless, hands folded in her lap, while the attendants worked methodically around her. Up to 10 layers could be applied, each taking 10 to 15 minutes to set in the cool air. By the time the final sweep was complete, her visage looked as though carved from ivory, smooth, pale, and utterly unyielding. Yet beneath this alabaster facade, the lead in the ceruse seeped relentlessly into her skin. Over the years, the queen's flesh bore the burden of chronic inflammation. Red welts formed beneath the powder, erupting into painful pustules that festered without ever fully healing. Hidden by the layers of ceruse, these sores multiplied, leaving Elizabeth's skin a landscape of silent suffering. Small nodules hardened beneath the surface, and the very texture of her skin grew coarse and brittle, as though the poison had turned flesh into parchment. The sensory consequence was as dire as the physical. As sweat mixed with the metallic compounds, the chamber filled with a pungent stench, an acrid, coppery odor that permeated every corner. Even the delicate floral scents could not fully mask this harsher tang. Servants spoke in hushed whispers of how the very air seemed to taste of rust, a constant reminder of the toxic price their sovereign paid for her image. Candles flickered, and shadows danced across pale walls, as though the palace itself recoiled at the odor that trailed the queen like a dark halo. And then there was her hair and scalp, equally sacrificed on the altar of appearance. Each morning, as the ceruse was applied, particles drifted into Elizabeth's auburn locks, settling into the roots and fine strands. Over time, her once luxuriant hair thinned in uneven patches, revealing tender pink scalp beneath. Dandruff-like flakes of lead powder mixed with dead skin to form heavy, foul-smelling scales that no comb could fully remove. To conceal these flaws, Elizabeth donned elaborate wigs, some towering, some adorned with pearls, but the underlying stench persisted, bound to the fibers of horsehair and linen. In private, attendants would use vinegar rinses and fragrant oils to soothe the queen's irritated scalp, but these measures offered only temporary relief. The root cause, the lead itself, continued its silent invasion, weakening hair follicles until large tufts fell away, exposing raw, aching skin. By late morning, Elizabeth's wigs, no matter how artfully arranged, carried the invisible weight of her daily torment. Yet she wore them without complaint, her lips pressed into a line of composed determination, even as the poison gnawed at her nerves. Thus did this daily ceruse ritual become both an act of sovereign beauty and a form of self-inflicted cruelty. Each morning's application strengthened her myth of pristine perfection, but deepened her private agony. By the time she entered the council chamber, her face gleamed brilliantly under torchlight, an emblem of imperishable youth, while beneath the mask her body writhed in silent protest, skin inflamed, flesh corroding, and hair reduced to fragile strands. And so Elizabeth lived between two extremes: the radiant icon adored by her subjects, and the suffering queen locked within layers of lead, whose true visage remained hidden from all but the willing accomplices of her own ritual. Soaking in rancid herbal baths became one of Elizabeth's most bizarre morning rituals, a practice meant to mask the stench of decay but which instead fostered its own brand of rot. Each day, before dawn's pale light crept through the high windows, attendants would draw a great copper tub and fill it with water laden with generous sprigs of rosemary and handfuls of dried chamomile flowers. These herbs, prized for their fragrance and soothing properties, were supposed to render the bath pleasantly aromatic. Instead, as the water stood overnight in the cold limestone chamber, it grew tepid and stagnant, an oily film rising to the surface, and a fetid odour seeping into the tapestries on the walls. Once Elizabeth stepped into the tub, her attendants would add yet more herbs in a futile attempt to freshen the brackish water. The queen, wrapped in only a linen shift, would lower herself into the steaming brew, her skin absorbing the rancid concoction. For minutes that stretched into an hour, she would stare blankly at the high ceiling, her thoughts lost in the haze of drugs and discomfort. Rosemary needles floated around her like broken glass, their needles pricking at her inflamed wounds. Chamomile blooms, once a promise of relief, lay blackened and slick in the trough, their petals clinging to her limbs in a slimy embrace. After the bath, a second ritual commenced, the application of animal fats to nourish the queen's skin. In heavy pewter bowls, attendants melted down horse tallow and sheep suet, stirring in melted beeswax until the mixture became a thick salve. With gloved hands, they would press the warm, greasy ointment into Elizabeth's flesh, massaging it over every inch of exposed skin. This practice was meant to soothe the irritation left by the herbal bath and the layer of lead powder worn beneath her garments. Instead, the greasy smothering clogged her pores, trapping residual toxins and fostering an environment ripe for bacterial growth. Underneath the sumptuous gowns, her skin seethed with unspoken misery. The consequences of these combined rituals soon became painfully clear. The occlusive tallow and suet, laden with earthy impurities, formed a sticky barrier against clean air and water. Bacteria flourished within the warm, oil-soaked layers, breaking down tissue and releasing noxious byproducts against Elizabeth's delicate skin. Small pustules erupted along her arms and torso, leaving narrow trails of scab and scar in their wake. The Queen's attendants began to whisper of a moth-eaten flesh, where flesh met corset so tightly that the very edges of her ribcage were marked by raised welts. Elizabeth herself felt the torment in every nerve. Beneath her finery, her body was a hive of itching and burning. During evening audiences, she would subtly shift her posture, attempting to ease the relentless prickle beneath her bodice. Yet any sign of discomfort had to be concealed behind a placid smile and a steady gaze. The grave irony was that these baths and ointments designed to preserve her regal poise had become the principal architects of her physical decay. Over time, the Queen's skin took on the appearance of aged leather, mottled and rigid, each stretch of fabric against it, evoking a faint cry of pain she would never allow herself to utter aloud. When she walked in the gardens at Whitehall, the gentle breeze that once carried the scent of blossoms instead tugged at her skirts weighted by residual grease, drawing the stale aroma of rancid herbs in her wake. Courtiers discreetly held scented pomanders nearby, attempting to mask the Queen's odour, but the noxious tang remained stubbornly present, as intimate and persistent as her own shadow. Moreover, the physical toll was matched by a growing psychological toll. Each day's soak in that fetid water, each layer of suffocating salve, reinforced the realization that her body was no longer her own, but a vessel to be manipulated for spectacle and statecraft. When she closed her eyes at night, she dreamt of pure springs and fresh air, of water that sparkled against her skin rather than sullying it. But at dawn, the cycle of rancid soak and greasy dressing began anew, a relentless reminder of the sacrifices demanded by her crown. Thus did the Queen's servants attend to her daily ablutions, executing a ritual that blurred the line between preservation and punishment. In those private chambers, the illusion of eternal youth and purity gave way to a hidden truth, that beneath the finery lay a body besieged by its own maintenance, a solemn testament to the cost of upholding an image that no flesh could bear. In the echoing silence of Whitehall's corridors, the spectre of Elizabeth's private suffering hovered like a faint, unwholesome perfume, one that no amount of royal decree could ever fully dispel. Dirty corset and sweat-soaked fabric marked the hidden torment that Elizabeth endured beneath her sumptuous gowns, for the rigid stays, waist belts and underpinnings were seldom washed, often reused for months on end without proper cleansing. Each morning her attendants would unlatch the myriad hooks and whalebone supports that cinched her waist, only to find layers of congealed sweat and body oils caked into the fabric. The corset, once a gleaming symbol of courtly fashion, had become a filthy relic pressed against her skin day after day, week after week, its grey-stained linen emitting a sour tang that no amount of perfumed pomanders could fully mask. Over time, the accumulated perspiration fermented within the interstices of the stays and the weave of the wasted bodice, producing an acrid stench reminiscent of spoiled meat. That smell clung fiercely to Elizabeth's dresses, the very air around her rising in waves of rank odour whenever she moved. Courtiers learned quickly to keep a discreet distance, inhaling through lace handkerchiefs, perfumed with rose and lavender, though even these delicate scents often proved inadequate against the persistent funk emanating from beneath her skirts. Worse, the damp, nutrient-rich environment of the corset's interior invited bacterial colonization. Tiny organisms thrived in the hidden warmth, proliferating within creases and folds until the very fabric seemed alive with decay. Elizabeth's skin, deprived of fresh air and perpetually moist, became a breeding ground for infection. Small areas of her torso would redden and swell, evolving into inflamed rashes and open sores that pulsed with heat. The queen, bound by duty and decorum, endured these afflictions in silence, pressing a perfumed cloth to her side to muffle the aches and resist the temptation to tear away the constricting garment. In a feeble attempt to conceal both the odour and the irritation, her attendants resorted to scattering scented powders, rose petal dust, crushed lavender buds, and grains of rock salt within the corset's folds. They hoped that these crude deodorizers might absorb moisture and assuage the worst of the smell. Instead, the abrasive particles only exacerbated Elizabeth's discomfort, abrading already tender skin and embedding themselves in the wounds. Each sprinkle of salt stung like tiny needles, provoking fresh flushes of redness and adding a salt-tinged sting to the festering sores. To soothe the resulting infections, poultices were applied mixtures of breadcrumbs, vinegar, and chopped herbs layered against the inflamed skin and bound with linen strips. These herbal compresses were intended to draw out the corrupted humours, yet frequently they fostered further bacterial growth, the warm, moist parcels becoming incubators for new infections. Elizabeth's attendants would furtively replace the poultices several times a day, discarding the soiled dressings in hidden chambers to avoid any hint that the queen's flesh bore wounds beneath her royal raiment. Despite the daily pain and persistent stench, Elizabeth never permitted the corset to be aired or the stays to be loosened in public. The hourglass silhouette it enforced was central to her image as the Virgin Queen, a visual proclamation of unassailable purity and power. So she endured the grime and the guffaws whispered behind fans, her slender form encased in layers of sweat and salt, the filthy garment a prison from which no pleasantries could free her. In the quiet moments after midnight, when the palace fell into hushed slumber, Elizabeth would sometimes slip from her finery into a simple shift, attempting to wash the day's filth from her skin. Yet even these secret ablutions were half-hearted, for she feared that any lowering of her standards might crack the perfect mask she had so painstakingly constructed. And so, she accepted the corset's foul embrace, as yet another sacrifice demanded by the crown, a private atrocity concealed beneath the glittering facade of sovereign majesty, a silent testament to the cost of maintaining an impossible ideal. The care of wigs and lice was among the most unsettling of Elizabeth's private rituals, a daily reminder that even her crowning glory was tainted by decay and vermin. Each morning, her attendants retrieved the elaborate wig's donut-shaped rolls of human and animal hair, intertwined with ribbons and jewels that had been fashioned to hide the queen's thinning, patchy locks. These wigs, worn for weeks or even months without proper cleaning, bore the accumulated grease of countless dressings and, more disturbingly, the telltale tang of lead pigment used to bleach stray hairs. The result was an oppressive stench, a heavy metallic odour that clung to the fibres and seeped into the heavy silk caps beneath. But the true horror lay not only in the smell, but in the pests that infested these ornate constructions. Lice and fleas, drawn by the warmth and oil, found refuge in the dense mass of strands, scuttling unseen among the curls. Servants whispered of the persistent scratching that would soon drive Elizabeth to distraction, her finely arched brows creasing with irritation as she fought the maddening tickle at her scalp. In response, her attendants resorted to desperate measures. Vinegar rinses, intended to suffocate the parasites, were dripped over the wigs and into every hidden nook, leaving the hairs stiff and sour. At times, the entire chamber would be filled with curling smoke from smouldering bundles of mugwort and rosemary, the fumes meant to drive out the lice but more often leaving unpleasant scorch marks on tapestries and carpets. Despite these frantic efforts, the pests proved tenacious. They burrowed deeper into the wigs, their eggs clinging to the inner lining as though daring any mortal hand to uproot them. Elizabeth herself would feel the stings of tiny bites, a constant, maddening itch that no amount of perfumed pomade could mask. There were nights when, in the privacy of her chamber, she would scratch until her fingertips bled, removing flakes of skin mixed with hair from her temples. The servants would find her the next morning, hunched over her dressing table, eyes reddened, with thready strands of hair clutched between her nails. To replace the infested wigs, new ones were brought forth hair dyed in pale shades to match the queen's powdered visage, sometimes tinted again with ceruse to maintain the illusion of flawless youth. Yet these, too, fell victim to the same cycle of infestation and decay. The constant reapplication of lead powder, both to Elizabeth's skin and to the hairpieces, perpetuated a breeding ground for bacteria, intensifying the itchy sores on the Queen's scalp. The pungent combination of rancid oil, herb fumes, and insect detritus created an atmosphere of silent torment that trailed Elizabeth like a half-seen spectre. Few in court dared mention the Queen's discomfort openly. To acknowledge her plight was to acknowledge a frailty in the sacred icon of the Virgin Queen. Instead, the courtiers maintained a discreet distance, voicing concern over her health in hushed tones while furtively holding scented handkerchiefs to their faces. Meanwhile, the Queen pressed on, her regal posture unshaken, even as every fibre of her hairpiece grew heavier with grime and infestation. In the pre-dawn hours, once the palace had hushed, and only the faint glow of embers remained in the hearth, Elizabeth would sometimes remove her wig and place it upon a carved ebony stand. There, by candlelight, she would inspect it with weary fingers, attempting to pluck out the parasites that had become her constant companions. The sensation of warm smoke drifting through the chamber, mixing with the odour of vinegar and lead, accompanied her in those moments of quiet desperation. Each expelled louse seemed a small victory, yet she knew they would return with the next dressing. Thus did the Queen's coiffural care become both spectacle and suffering, a grotesque counterpoint to the elegance she projected in public. Each time she ascended the steps of the palace dais or presided over the Privy Council, her immaculate wig concealed a hideous secret. A teeming nest of pests, a scalp raw from scratching, and a soul battered by the relentless itch. In the hushed corridors of Whitehall, the echoes of Elizabeth's private agony mingled with the rustle of silken gowns, a silent testament to the price she paid for an image that no human head could ever perfectly bear. Personal cleansing before sleep became Elizabeth's final weary ritual each day, a hurried attempt to erase the grime of her countless ordeals before succumbing to restless slumber. In the dim lantern light of her private chamber, attendants would gather the soiled linen's handkerchiefs stained with sweat, towels flecked with dried blood and pus from her festering wounds, and carry them away to be consigned to the flames. Each scorched scrap of cloth was burned in secret pyres behind the palace walls, the embers eating through the evidence of her suffering until nothing remained but ash. This nightly purge ensured that no trace of her physical agony would linger to betray the immaculate legend she maintained by day. Yet in the same breath, the Queen's bed, a canopy draped in heavy damask, remained a shrine to neglect. The fine linen sheets, once laundered with care, were reused night after night, their fibres never fully cleansed of the residue they absorbed. Moisture from her night sweats seeped into the folds, mingling with ancient oils and powders until the fabric carried the sour tang of stagnation. In the pale glow of dawn, those linens would be peeled back and smoothed over again, ready to become witness to another cycle of torment. When it came to makeup removal, Elizabeth permitted only the most cursory effort. A maid dabbed at her cheeks and forehead with a cloth barely damp enough to lift the surface layer of ceruse, leaving behind a fine white film that continued to choke her pores. Beneath the half-hearted cleansing, dried powder mingled with residual sweat, suffocating the skin and preventing any true purification. No proper wash of water and soap ever followed, for such an indulgence would have risked revealing the pallid, ulcerated flesh beneath her cosmetic veneer. Over the weeks and months, this pattern of neglect left its mark upon Elizabeth's features. The constant occlusion by lead and oils turned her skin a sallow, ashen grey, a complexion far removed from the radiant alabaster she strived to project. Follicles inflamed beneath the surface, evolving into clusters of pustules and nodules that spread across her cheeks and chin. Charles Pomona, the Queen's personal physician, would note in his private journals the weeping of the skin and the eruption of foul humours, yet his prescribed remedies, poorly absorbed salves and purgatives, offered little relief. At times Elizabeth would gaze at her reflection in a tiny fragment of mirror, seeing not the regal sovereign she embodied before her courtiers, but a woman unmoored from her own flesh. The mirror, smudged with streaks of powder and grime, offered only a ghostly outline of her visage, a cautionary image of power built upon a foundation of self-neglect. With a sigh, she would close her eyes and lean back upon her pillow, the weight of her masked identity pressing against her temples as the room faded into darkness. These nightly routines, both destructive and desperate, underscored the Queen's unrelenting commitment to her public persona. Each sheet left unwashed, each cloth consigned to fire, each lazy swipe of a damp rag over her cheeks, became part of the hidden ledger of sacrifice she maintained. By the time her breathing fell into a steady rhythm, signaling the onset of sleep, Elizabeth's body lay cradled in a bed of half-truths, her skin raw with the consequences of neglect, her spirit adrift between the realms of performance and reality. Thus did personal hygiene, that most intimate of acts, become yet another site of Elizabeth's private torment. In the quiet hush that followed the burning of her soiled linens, all that remained was the weight of her crown, and the fragile hope that tomorrow's dawn would bring yet another opportunity to preserve the perfect illusion she had paid so dearly to uphold.